Hello and welcome to the Mitigation Planning Policy Update webinar. My name is Shubha Srivastav and I work at FEMA headquarters. Today I will be talking to you about the updates to the local mitigation planning policy. We will cover an overview of mitigation planning and the policy document. We will introduce the updated local mitigation planning policy. And then we will talk about the details of those updates before going into next steps and resources. So here we are going to talk about a quick overview of mitigation planning and the policy document. This slide has some definitions. Hazard mitigation is all about long-term risk reduction to human life and property from natural hazards. Hazard mitigation planning is that coordinated process used by states, local governments, tribal and territorial governments to identify their risks from natural disasters and develop strategies to reduce or eliminate long-term risk. The mitigation plans are those living documents that become the blueprint for mitigation and resilience. They guide mitigation investments using a wide range of resources. The investments could be through FEMA or other federal grants, but they could also be through the private sector or by nonprofits. As the local mitigation planning process brings partners from the whole community together across multiple sectors like infrastructure and economic development to take mitigation action. This slide explains the why of mitigation planning. Mitigation planning can save lives, it can reduce risk. Mitigation planning helps with that risk-informed decision-making and involves the whole community. Mitigation planning is foundational to preparing for the future as climate change is exacerbating the frequency and severity of natural hazards. The planning process includes participation from the whole community and therefore helps direct mitigation resources to where they are most needed. The planning process also helps states, tribes, and local governments to be more prepared for disaster recovery. Mitigation planning saves lives and money. The most recent 2019 mitigation saves study shows that every dollar invested in mitigation saves $6 in losses avoided. And mitigation is most effective when it is implemented through a rational planning process rather than through disjointed products or efforts. When a mitigation plan is adopted, it reflects commitment towards taking action that's carefully thought through. This next slide has the map that shows the wide reach of the mitigation planning program. All of that light blue that you see on the US map is where there is a current mitigation plan. So mitigation planning is an established and repeated process practiced in all 50 states, DC, and the US territories, and many local governments and tribes. Mitigation plans are a prerequisite for certain kinds of non-emergency disaster assistance from FEMA. This table provides general requirements for planning and project grants. For more details, we encourage you to visit our website and click Mitigation Planning and Grants on the left-hand side, or review the applicable program guidance for details on the eligibility requirements. This slide also reminds us that mitigation planning lays that foundation, and then mitigation actions can be funded by a variety of FEMA or other funding sources. With that, we are going to talk about the Local Mitigation Planning Policy Guide, the 2022 guide. Here is the cover, and this is FEMA's official policy on local mitigation planning. It interprets the Code of Federal Regulations, CFR, that has the mitigation planning requirements. The relevant requirements are in Section 201.3 and Section 201.6. We encourage you to go to our website and download and go through the entire document. Here's the cover that has the release date and the effective date. Local planning responsibilities include preparing and adopting the mitigation plan. That local adoption is really critical and reflects the commitment to follow up the mitigation planning process with action. And updating the mitigation plan every 5 years reinforces that commitment and allows for further implementation and submitting it for approval. State planning responsibilities include coordinating all of state and local mitigation activities, providing training and technical assistance, updating the state level mitigation plan every 5 years, and reviewing and submitting approvable state and local plans to FEMA. The state also communicates plan status and supports local and tribal officials that are interested in applying for FEMA assistance. FEMA responsibilities are to oversee all pre- and post-disaster mitigation programs and activities. FEMA also communicates plan status data and eligibility and reviews and approves mitigation plans every 5 years. So with those introductory and overview comments and slides, these are some of the key objectives that we kept in mind when we were updating the local planning policy. We wanted to underline the value of mitigation planning, the value of those community level conversations that mitigation planning begins and starts and lays that foundation for action. We also wanted to align with FEMA strategic priorities that are really national priorities for mitigation and resilience. These include planning for climate change, future conditions, and equity, and they are also reflected in the FEMA strategic plan recently released. The local policy also tries to connect mitigation planning to community planning and building codes in a stronger way than before. The policy updates support integration with FEMA programs, like the grant programs that we mentioned before, and other mitigation and resilience programs that have been around, like the National Flood Insurance Program and the Community Rating System Program, and most recent updates in all of those programs. We attempted to incorporate feedback from the stakeholder engagement sessions that we held in 2020 when we started this policy update process. And really what we heard from that feedback is in a summary report on our website. But the biggest takeaway we got from that feedback was that this plan review and approval process needs to be streamlined and make for a better customer experience for mitigation planning to be effective and have meaningful outcomes. This was the process of updating the local planning guide. That 2020 stakeholder engagement happened when COVID had just started. And then we continued through 2021, the writing, development, and various rounds of internal reviews. And we are now finalizing and rolling out the policy, and it will become effective in 1 year's time, which is April 2023. One note there is that the requirements that are about the high hazard potential dam grant program will become effective with the release of their notice of funding opportunity, whenever that happens in 2022. Okay, so now we will talk about detailed updates to the mitigation planning policy. We start with a summary of these updates. All of the updates are not only in the elements section of the policy. Some of them are in the beginning part of the guide, and so we do encourage you, again, to read the entire updated document. So we have emphasized the importance of right-sizing the scope of a plan update. Every 5-year update is an opportunity to advance the work done so far. Please take every 5-year update as a chance to build on the progress made and really only update where there are reasons for the update and focus the update on those real reasons besides the 5-year compliance cycle requirement. The updates to the local policy also emphasize including representatives from a broad range of sectors. You will notice those updates in the planning process section, where we have emphasized including community lifelines and nonprofits that support underserved communities. The updated policy asks to consider the effects of climate change and other future conditions, that's population change and land use change, when doing the risk assessment and the mitigation strategy. The updates also ask to address existing mitigation plan requirements of the High Hazard Potential Dam Grant Program. The capability assessment asks to describe building codes and land use and development ordinances to connect better to existing planning and building codes in the community. And last but not the least, it is really, really important to complete that planning process with plan adoption. And so there are many parts of the local policy update, especially in the procedures section, that emphasize and have really underlined the value of plan adoption. All right, so we will talk about each of the section and the elements. Planning process, which is element A, we have defined certain terms better so that there's better understanding, and we want to promote really meaningful engagement in the planning process. We have clarified that participation from a broad range of stakeholders will make the mitigation planning process really meaningful. We've added examples to each of these categories of stakeholders in the new guide, in the updated guide. And for example, the representatives of businesses and academia now talk about owners, employers, and owners of community lifelines that are really critical to keeping the community going. And this is not a very new concept. It is really just calling out, highlighting what mitigation planning has always talked about, emphasizing critical facilities, and that is really what we're talking about here as community lifelines. The nonprofit category of stakeholders was also there as a stakeholder group, and now we have clarified that that would also include community-based organizations that support underserved communities and socially vulnerable populations. The planning process also has elements about using existing plans, studies, reports, and technical information. And in that portion, we have clarified that communities must use regulatory flood mapping products. They are highly encouraged to use the non-regulatory, also called as risk map products. So those are highly encouraged, but the regulatory ones must be used. And there are some changes that you will notice around the plan maintenance requirements, because they don't necessarily happen during the planning process. So we've moved them to a new element. Those are also based on some of the stakeholder feedback we received on having the right elements in the right order and place. The risk assessment has emphasized that the probability of future occurrences must consider the effects of climate change. And the risk and vulnerability assessment must consider the effects of all of these changes. The climate is changing, the population and demographics are changing, and land use is changing. And all of them play a role in the changing risk of the community. And the purpose of these mitigation plans is to plan for the future and not just be looking backwards to fix the problems of the past. So the risk assessment also clarifies that previous occurrences must include major disaster declarations. If your participating jurisdiction was not affected by that, regional disaster, it is okay to state that in the plan, but we just need that awareness, make sure you've looked at that latest information, especially since most plans are now updates. We would like, to every participating jurisdiction to consider what's happened in those last 5 years. And we've also attempted to explain these confusing terms, extent, impact, and vulnerability a little bit better, so that hopefully it is clearer of what are the differences between these definitions. And I'd also like to remind that since most plans are updates, the plan update elements, element E, also apply to many of these risk assessments. So make sure to make that connection to element E. Even though they're just appearing a little bit later in the document, they do apply to risk assessment. In the mitigation strategy, there are two parts, capability assessment and mitigation strategy. The capability assessment has the requirement to describe existing programs and policies, and we have clarified now that those must talk about building codes and land use development ordinances, what's there currently, and having an awareness of that, and having coordination with those building code officials and the planning departments, the local planning department. We really want that coordination to happen, because that will inform how those can be very critical pieces of mitigation capabilities in the future. Compliance with the NFIP has been a requirement, and we have now added a few more details to explain how a community can show continued compliance with the NFIP, including how the community plans to implement and enforce the substantial improvement and substantial damage provisions. So calling that out is another point of integration with the new CRS element of activity of having a substantial damage plan. And if you have that, and if you describe that in the mitigation plan also, so that is helpful, and it integrates both programs. And any of these existing programs and continued compliance activities can inform future mitigation actions, because it's separated out on how you can expand or improve these mitigation capabilities. And once again, there is the reminder to look at the plan update element E, that talks about, where are the changes in these capabilities? So discuss them. In the mitigation strategy, plans must have an analysis of a comprehensive range of actions. So these 4 categories of actions that mitigation planning process always has talked about, all 4 categories must be considered, and there should be an analysis, which means a narrative that explains the reasoning of why certain types of actions were picked over others. This analysis also helps with the CRS floodplain management activity, and we encourage you that if you are participating in the community rating system, CRS, then you refer to the bulletin and take advantage of both the processes at the same time as much as possible. The mitigation strategy also redefines mitigation action to clarify that long-term intent of mitigation. It clarifies that there should be 1 or more actions identified for implementation. per community, per hazard. And really the most important aspect of the mitigation action should be that it addresses the risks identified in the risk assessment. And once again, a reminder of consulting plan update element, element E. Element D talks about plan integration and maintenance, where we would like to see some, stronger connection with the existing planning, and for each jurisdiction explaining how that plan integration occurred in the last 5 years. There's some reorganization of the elements and redefining for responding to that stakeholder feedback of clarity. Then in element E, these are the plan update elements that should provide additional clarification about changes in development. And those should cover all of those three categories that I actually talked about just before. And the plan must also describe changes in priorities, status of mitigation actions, and plan integration efforts. So all of the work that's happened in the last 5 years since the last update must be described in this element E. Now, element F really emphasizes plan adoption, and there are a few ways we have done that. We really wanted to clarify that approvable pending adoption status is not, equal to approved plan. So it does not mean that you have an approved plan if you have an APA letter, APA status. You do need to adopt the plan and become approved so that you can be, moving ahead with your mitigation actions and also be eligible for all of those grant programs. We have clarified that jurisdictions participating in a multi-jurisdictional plan must adopt the plan within 1 year. If 1 year has passed after that APA status is assigned, then those jurisdictions would have to either update their information or validate their information. In the current policy, we say that the entire plan must be updated, but in the updated policy, we have clarified that though it is only their portion of the plan that those participating jurisdictions would have to update or validate if more than 1 year has passed after receiving APA status. Another option that the updated policy provides is to submit adoption resolutions with the plan. When you're submitting the plan to the state or to FEMA, you can adopt the plan beforehand. Now, in the current policy, we recommend that you follow this process on the right. That is the current process, that you submit the plan, and then only when it is approvable pending adoption, jurisdictions adopt and receive the approved status. But the updated policy is providing this option of submitting all of the adoption resolutions before, before the plan is APA. So by the time there is the FEMA review, state and FEMA review and approval, it can directly go to approval. So this is intended to streamline that plan review and approval process. We have also provided a sample resolution that has some flexible language that can be used so that jurisdictions, if there are minor revisions, from the state and FEMA review, then the local jurisdiction should really not have to re-adopt the plan. It's really up to the local government if they consider those revisions to make substantial changes to the plan that they would have to need to re-adopt. There are changes to the plan review tool. You will notice that it's longer because we have included these sub-elements that were not included before. And we heard from the stakeholder feedback that it was a problem not to have the sub-elements there because you couldn't track if they were meeting, if each of the sub-elements were met. So you'll notice that the plan review tool looks a little different, longer. Hopefully it makes for a better and streamlined plan review and approval process. And here is the outline of the whole document. We have some new sections in the beginning part of the guide that I talked about. Please read the beginning part of the guide as well as the plan review tool, the entire policy document. Here is the sample adoption resolution that I was talking about with some flexible language if jurisdictions wanted to adopt before submitting the plan for review. We also have our template letters. The APA letter has attempted to really clarify that it does not mean approved status. Plan is not approved yet when you are APA. We have a new appendix about amending the plan and jurisdictions that want to join the plan later. And then the acronyms, the CFR, and the HHPD appendices are kind of self-explanatory. So the key takeaways from today's webinar and from the policy update should be that every plan update is an opportunity. Please use the plan update opportunity every 5 years to advance the mitigation work, build on the progress that's already made, use as much as possible of the previous planning efforts, but take some strides forward. Mitigation planning requirements are not prescriptive. We do not say that you should have a certain kind of mitigation action, but what we are asking is for an analysis or a narrative that explains that you did look at all types of mitigation actions, including nature-based solutions and including regulatory options for future risk. So what you're really trying to do is address current and future risks. If a local government cannot fully address a requirement, then that can be noted and turned into an action. We have been doing that in practice, but that is now written down in the policy. And we highly encourage early and ongoing coordination and communication with the state and with your FEMA region so that your planning process is really as successful as possible and your plan review and approval process is as streamlined as possible. With that, I want to cover some next steps. There is a 1-year transition period, which means you may have less than all of the 12 months if your plan is already in progress, because what we are applying the policy is that the policy will go into effect on April 19, 2023, which means all plans approved on or after April 19, 2023 must comply with the updated policy. The only exception or caveat, although the plan, approved, it should be an approved status, which means if it's a multi-jurisdictional plan and one jurisdiction has adopted it, then it's approved status, then the other jurisdictions can continue to adopt after the effective date without complying with the updated policy. Some resources to help meet these requirements. Our 44 CFR has the actual regulations. Our current products, the state planning key topic bulletins and the local planning handbook, will be updated. We have started these updates and we will work on them as soon as possible and get them in your hands. But in the meantime, we have some training YouTube videos on these key topics that formed the key objectives of these policy updates. The where and how we build one explains the importance of building codes and land use planning. in mitigation and resilience. The scoping of the mitigation plan talks about that right sizing the scope of your mitigation plan. And the future conditions one explains how to address future conditions in your mitigation plan. And our foundational courses, the 329 and the 318 state and local courses, we've also begun those updates, and we will be making those available as soon as possible. With that, I encourage you to visit our website and email us. You are also welcome to coordinate with your FEMA regional planner throughout your planning process. Thank you very much for your time and attention to these local mitigation planning policy updates. Thank you.